Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining. We'll give it a few minutes for others to come in from the waiting room. Feel free to go ahead and introduce yourselves in the chat as you're coming in. Welcome, everyone. We'll wait 1 or 2 more minutes. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat, and we'll get started soon. Still have a few more people trickling in from the waiting room. We'll give it about 30 more seconds, and then we'll get started. All right, let's get started. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Courtney Cooperman. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm so excited to welcome all of you to the 8th webinar in the Our Homes, Our Votes bi-weekly webinar series. It's hard to believe it, but we're actually halfway through the 16-part series. So thanks to everyone who's been here the whole time. And for those of you who are new, we're glad to have you. There's a lot that's happened and a lot to look forward to as well. Today's webinar will focus on the role of tenant organizing in increasing voter participation, what these organizing efforts look like, and an exciting new proposal relating to civic engagement among HUD tenants. And just a reminder, as always, this webinar is being recorded, and the recording and resources will be sent out to you afterwards. We'll have some time to ask questions for each of our panelists, so please use the Q&A box throughout the session, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible. Today, we're excited to welcome Abby Eng and Genesis Aquino, who are the Policy and Communications Coordinator and Executive Director, respectively, at Tenants and Neighbors. We'll have Sarah Saadian, Senior VP for Public Policy and Field Organizing here at NLIHC, and Sydney Betancourt, who's also a housing advocacy organizer at NLIHC. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Abby to get us started.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm here today to talk about what Tenants and Neighbors is doing to engage tenants in electoral work. And I'm joined as well by our Executive Director, Genesis. So I will hand it over to Genesis first to give a little bit more information about who we are as an organization, and then we'll get into some of the tactics and tools we use and some of the obstacles we've faced so far this election season.
Hello, everyone. My name is Genesis Aquino, ED at Tenants and Neighbors. Excited to be here with all of you today. So a brief introduction to Tenants and Neighbors. We are a statewide organization based in New York, and our work focuses on tackling displacement of low and middle income people from their homes and their communities. Tenants and Neighbors believe that the best method of challenging displacement is via grassroots tenants movement, with active and engaged leadership from low and moderate income tenants from low and moderate income tenants and members who are educated, empowered, and working to preserve at-risk affordable housing in our neighborhoods, experiencing gentrification. Because New York should be a place where people from all walks of life can put down roots and build a stable and diverse community, right? Just like any other place in this country. So we organize to help tenants preserve the character and fabric of neighborhood against gentrification and displacement. So I think at the root, we do that because we believe that we need to organize in a grassroots way because we need to tackle the root, right? The root of the problem of displacement from which is I got a little nervous. Which is the imbalance in power between tenants and the real estate industry. And for this reason, our core activity at Tenants and Neighbors is providing organizing support and technical assistance to tenants who are facing loss of affordability, possible displacement from their homes and their communities, and who want to organize campaign and build affordable housing, habitable housing, right? Safe and healthy homes. So this campaign, Our Homes, Our Votes, we chose to do this campaign because for us, it is important to do movement work. Without movement work, we cannot tackle displacement, right? And loss and affordability of affordable housing. So at Tenants and Neighbors, we prioritize leadership development. So we train our tenant leaders and members to understand the power dynamic. And by understanding the power dynamic, we teach them also how to engage in electoral politics from a point of civic engagement. So our leaders are learning about policy and learning about how to get involved in the electoral process, because the only way to do that is by choosing the candidates that are pro-housing, right? That are pro-affordable housing. Abby, you can take on. So
Sure, yeah.
Yes.
So we're really excited to be working with NLIHC on our statewide Our Homes, Our Votes campaign because it's a really natural fit for the work that we already do as tenants, as Genesis mentioned. That's leadership development. That's a lot of housing movement work. And it's a natural fit because if we don't have, as I'm sure most of you know, if we don't have elected officials who believe in tenant rights, believe in affordable housing, and if they also don't see that tenants are voting, tenants aren't going to be able to hold their elected officials as accountable. And so our goal really is to reach tenants who, through our tenant leaders, to engage in electoral work and engagement. And so some of the tactics and tools that we have been using so far this election season include phone banking, canvassing, in coordination with a lot of voter data we have through VAN. We've been working on a candidate questionnaire, and we'll be hosting a candidate forum as well. But I know that Genesis and I are here today to talk mostly about, how do we integrate our tenant organizing work with Our Homes, Our Votes, with electoral engagement. And so one of the main ways that we've been doing that is through workshops and trainings. So in the past, we've partnered with the League of Women Voters here in New York to offer workshops on making a voting plan, information about the recent redistricting that's happened in our state that has been really confusing for voters, talking about how to check your registration status, where is your polling site, really foundational basic information, but important for people to know, and a lot of tenants may not be as familiar and may be especially confused this election season because we've gone through a lot of redistricting. So we've really found that those trainings have been helpful and useful for tenants. The other part of that is we have monthly tenant association meetings in a lot of the buildings that we organize. And so since those meetings are already happening, it was really easy to kind of integrate voter education into that work. And so during those monthly TA meetings, we'll take 10 to 15 minutes of that meeting just to talk about, do tenants plan on voting? Why is it important to vote? How are they going to vote this year, whether that's absentee or early voting? And to address the question in the chat, we're based in New York State. And so, so in New York State this year, we've got 2 primary city redistricting. So to address some of that confusion, we've really focused on voter education. Some other workshops that we plan on having focus on candidate information, kind of going over like the candidate questionnaire that we put together with our tenant leaders that address housing policy that impacts them directly. And just to note also, because of our capacity as Tenants Neighbors, we're a pretty small staff. We're really targeting registered voters that don't typically vote in the primary election. And that's especially important for us here in New York because because it's such a democratic state, the primaries usually determine who the elected is going to be. And so it's really important that people vote in the primary. And then, I'm going to hand it to Hennessy's to talk about some of the obstacles that we've been facing this year and how we're combating that.
Yeah, again, like as Abby mentioned, this year we are going through redistricting. So it has been, I would say, the main challenge because usually people vote one time during the primaries. And that's usually, it has changed a lot in the last few years. It used to be in September, and about 2 years ago, right before the pandemic, it was changed to June. So people are still adjusting to the new date of primaries. That's one. And then because of the redistricting, a lot of electoral districts were changed. So people were changed poll sites. There are tenants who have been voting at the same poll site for over 20 years. That has changed this year. And that completely changed the amount of people that came out to vote. So this year we had 8,065 registered Democrats. And that's roughly about 13% of the people only 13% of the people who are registered to vote as Democrat came out to vote, which is super low, lower than prior years. Apart from that, another, I would say, discouragement that people may have, obstacle that people may have is discouragement. And I would say that because some people, the people that we currently organize are people who are living in low income neighborhoods and live in federally subsidized housing like project-based Section 8 buildings. And oftentimes they are targeted in the primaries because they live in very big buildings, right? And although they have been targeted in election season, they are not engaged in the process of election work, right? Of policy creation, anything regarding election. And also see very little results when it comes to improvement in their living standards. So a lot of people, when you talk to them, they say, why should I vote? I see nothing has been fixed on my street, or nothing has been fixed in my building or apartment. And again, the candidates only come here to get a vote, and they will never visit us again. Of course, it's not exactly the same for each building, for each community. In some communities, people are more engaged than others, but that's usually the case. And unfortunately, in New York, well, I guess it's a reflection of the nation, but most most of the votes in the state come from the most affluent communities, and most of the affluent communities tend to be white in comparison to the communities that we are organizing, which tend to be low income and people of color, mostly Hispanic and African American. So that's that. And again, this year we also seen a lot of changes in housing increases. Sorry, in the increases of rent, and the current housing crisis has not prioritized low income people, right? The people who are engaged in the primaries, right, in the primaries and election right now, people who are running for office are not necessarily bringing that up. We recently have a mayor who appointed the Rent Island Board, and most of the people impacted by the increases were people who live in rent stabilized. And that's usually a local issue, right? It's done at the city of New York. So people are less likely to engage in federal election and state election because their housing issues are often decided, at least a majority of the people, right, are rent stabilized and rent control, and that's decided at the local level. So that's another thing we are also trying to change, and by making changes at the state level and engaging people with the process, because a lot of people don't know that policies trickle down to the city. So a lot of education is needed to make the connection right now between the real estate lobby and politics, and that's what we're doing with this work. I'm open to question. I think it's easier also to answer some questions about our work and give more information if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Abby and Hennessis. There are a lot of good questions coming in through the Q&A and the chat. So one that I want to throw out to you from Kristen is, how did you develop your candidate questionnaire? Is tenant and resident input included in the generation of questions? And are there templates for useful questions that you'd recommend drawing from?
Yeah, I can answer that. And I think it's a great question. And I think it's one of the tools that we've put together that our members are most interested in. And I think, that is in part because the way we developed it, it started off with a meeting with our tenant leaders. And we were really able to lean on some of our, pre-existing tenant leadership development structure at Tenants and Neighbors. We've had tenants who have been organizing their buildings for decades and are very experienced and very well versed in all of the housing policy issues that really affect their day-to-day lives. So they're the experts. We wanted to counsel them, and so we had this meeting. We brainstormed together, like, what are the issues that you're most interested in? And some of those questions included like, are the candidates taking real estate money? Because the tenants understand that that's where a lot of the real estate industry's power comes from. So really important to include questions like that. Some were more nitty-gritty policy questions about rent stabilization or rental assistance programs, repairs. But yeah, a lot of the ideas came directly from tenants. And then we put together a questionnaire, try to keep it as brief as possible because it is very challenging to get responses from candidates who are getting questionnaires all the time. And so we actually did use the template that NLIHC has put together to help form our questionnaire. We used a similar format. And so now we're working on publishing the responses to that questionnaire on our website, and tenants can access those responses through like a QR code that we passed out when we've done canvassing.
I think it's also important to mention a challenge with the questionnaire, which also comes from redistricting, right? We initially had a primary date, and that changed, and candidates were not notified until last minute because there was a lawsuit again. After the commission chose a day, there was a lawsuit against that, and then the court decided to state another day for the primary. So a lot of candidates did not answer on the deadline that we set. So we had to restart the process and resend it again and change the deadline and wait for candidate to respond.
Thank you. And I'll find the link for the sample candidate questionnaire from the Our Homes, Our Votes resources that you referred to somewhere on the Our Homes, Our Votes website. We also got a few questions about canvassing. How do you generate a list of residents in affordable housing developments to cross-check registration status for targeting outreach? And along with that, how often do you canvass?
Okay, so we are doing a targeted campaign. So we are using also BAN, which is a voter access network, which is a very good tool. It costs money, but we were able to get the tool, and with the tool, we were able to enter the data, right? We chose certain buildings where we are organizing, low income buildings, and then from that, we matched it with data records, right, on BAN, and we took out people who are registered to vote, and then from that list, we select people. We create our own universe, right? We want to target people who don't vote during the primaries. Like most of the people that we organize do not vote during the primary. So we are selecting specific buildings, and then people who do not tend to vote, and then we divide the list by building, right? And then we divide it all by organ. I mean, we are choosing the canvassing date based on the election calendar. So, for example, the next primary is on August 23rd, right? So we are going to be doing GOTV right before the last day to register to vote for that primary, and the last day to, or near the deadline for people to request an absentee ballot. So we are going to be doing test banking to most of the tenants we are organizing, the ones included and not included on the list, so they know. And then we are targeting those tenants who don't vote during the primary so they can get engaged. And then we are doing GOTV, some GOTV work during the day of election. I hope that answers the question. I don't know if you want to add anything else, Abby.
Yeah, I'll add just a little bit. And I think the key to making our canvassing successful has been really focusing on our relationships in the community, having really relationship-driven strategy for this campaign. So we're not just going into any subsidized building, but we're really targeting buildings where we have existing relationships with tenant leaders and working with those tenant leaders to canvass the building. So they know their neighbors, and we have relationships with the tenant leaders there. And so those relationships get people to the doors to have a conversation, and ultimately, repeated contact in each of those buildings gets them to the polls. So it's not random, it's really strategic. And we're able to do that through VAN, where we can enter the address for those buildings that we have relationships in and see who's registered and what their voting history is, so we can target people who don't typically vote in the primaries.
Thanks. We also got a question from Claudia. What do you do to engage people with disabilities and seniors who may have extra obstacles to getting to the polls?
Well, most of the people that we organize are already senior citizens. they are like middle-aged and senior citizen people. So again, I think is based on relationships. We work closely with the tenant association board, which is the president, the vice president. They know where to knock on doors. We are also letting people know that they can request the absentee ballots, so that way they get to participate in the election without having to leave their home, or at least, maybe have a family member send out the absentee ballot, which is something, because of the pandemic, something that has been expanded to most people, whether they are disabled or not.
Great. And then I think you alluded to this before. Maybe you could expand on it a little bit. Do you host town hall meetings?
Yes and no. So in regards to the campaign, what we plan to do is a forum with the candidates. So we are planning to invite the candidates and have tenants interview candidates and see where they stand on certain not public, affordable housing policies, right? So it is kind of a town hall, but I don't know if that's the definition. I mean, the term which you use. Yeah. And also, I think, we have leadership committees with tenants based on their type of housing. And often during those committees, we try to do meetings with the local elected official, right? So they can also engage with those offices. And that helps a lot when it comes to the forum, because they're more informed about policy already.
Great. And then I know your current campaign is focused on registered voters who haven't historically turned out in the primaries. But we did get a question, is there an effective method for identifying eligible but unregistered residents?
So I don't know, but what we are doing is also talking to people. I mean, a goal that we have is to talk to people who participate in the tenant association meetings, who may or not be registered to vote, right? So we will have a pawn card and also a flyer that tells people how to register to vote, how to locate the poll site, and give them, more information about election. And also letting them know that if we're trying to, besides targeting the people who don't vote, but also targeting the household members in that tenant's home that may not be registered to vote. So it's based on relationship already, based on our own universe, right? Because oftentimes in New York City, it's very common to see a mixed citizenship family. Maybe there's one citizen and then maybe two of them are not eligible to register to vote. Or somebody's eligible to register to vote but doesn't know. So we are targeting those same household in different ways.
Totally, that makes a lot of sense. And then we got another question, how do you collect data? So how are you determining whether your efforts are successful and people are actually turning out to vote?
So we are in the process of developing that. Maybe, Abby is working directly on that. We're going to be collecting data in different ways, right? We have BAN, which is Voter Access Network, and you can track down, for example, we call Jane Doe. Jane Doe has not voted, but we plan to do a survey at the end to see, well, a survey when we make the contact to see if the person is likely to vote, and then towards the end, after election, to see if that person actually went out to vote. That's one way. We are also developing another survey to do over the phone with people that we have contact regularly with. Abby, you may want to elaborate more on that.
Sure, yeah. So it's all about, I think, follow-up in terms of being able to track this. So as Hennis mentioned, using Van to follow up with folks, after we've door knocked with them, being able to, maybe send them a quick text or a quick call saying like, did you vote? How did you vote? Things like that. And then we also have sort of a hotline at Tenants Neighbors where people can call with their housing questions. And so at the tail end of those counseling calls, we've also added a brief survey about voting, which is in part informational, but also to get feedback. So we'll ask them questions about like, are you registered? Do you know where your polling site is? And we can have a brief conversation about that information if they don't know. And then at the end of that short conversation, we have a question in the survey that's like, did you learn something new about how to vote during this conversation? And so we're able to track if we're providing new information to tenants that way.
That's really great. Kind of on a related note, Jenny asked the question, do you include election protection information in your educational materials?
Election protection information, we didn't think about that because we already elaborated a flyer, but we will.
Awesome.
Yeah, we did a training and that was mentioned during the training, right? We did it via video 101, right? I mean, a video training, but that's something to be included on the flyer as well when we are door knocking and canvassing, so people know where to call in case there is election, how you call it,
like voter suppression.
Voter suppression, yeah, which is very common in New York. Like in 2018, 20% of Latino and Black voters were purged out of the list. You couldn't find your name, and that was very problematic. But every year we have very similar issues. So it is important that people know and are educated on how to protect their privilege, right? To vote.
Totally.
The
Yeah,
right
thank
to
you
vote.
thank you for sharing that, Jenny. I think that's covered most of the questions from the audience. I just wanted to ask one more question. So, of course, all of this like incredible organizing, it's all also amazing, but ultimately there are things in the system that could change to make it easier for tenants to register and turn out to vote. So are there like particular policy changes that you would want to see in New York that would take some of this burden off of you and just make the whole process easier?
Of course. I mean, I also can elaborate on this, but I think, one of the policies we're looking forward to is same-day voter registration, which will take a lot of burden from people, having, or organizers, right? And community leaders or having to register people way before the primaries or way before election day, in the general election in November, which, people don't necessarily keep track of deadlines. And other advanced countries and even developing countries have same-day registration. There is also another, it's not necessarily too related to federal policy, but in New York City, the city council recently passed a bill to allow immigrant people who have permanent residency, legal permanent residency, right, in New York, in the United States, to be able to vote in the municipal election. That will, it doesn't take the burden from registering people, but will allow so many people to influence housing policy in New York City, because New York City has the biggest stock of housing in the state of New York. And a lot of the people impacted are people who right now cannot vote because of their citizenship status. Again, there is a bill that recently passed from one of our local senators in the state of New York. It's called the Voting Rights Act. Abby is up to date with this. She can elaborate on this one.
Yeah, so kind of related to Jenny's earlier question, the this Rights Act that passed recently in New York State, it provides, you know, a deeper level of protection against voter suppression, especially against like language minority groups and other protected classes. And so hoping to see how this impacts future elections since it was just recently passed.
Thank you. Yeah, I remember being really excited both about that state law and about New York City expanding voting rights to immigrants. That's really, really awesome to see. One more audience question from Kristen. What have you found effective in combating election-related mis- and disinformation?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, what have you found effective in combating election-related misinformation and disinformation, which I know can often be targeted at communities of color?
I would say, you know, one of the main priorities of our campaign is voter education, and because we're not only trying to combat disinformation and, you know, ways that people are trying to discourage people from voting, but also trying to combat that housing is not as politicized as it could be. So, for example, you know, so many people across the country, including in New York, are facing these really, really unreasonable rent increases. And we see that as, you know, an opportunity to kind of leverage people's anger and connect that to, well, you know, your rent increase is actually a political issue that your lawmakers could do something about. And so that's why you should vote. And so I think kind of flipping a lot of the reasons that discourage people from voting and turning that into a conversation about what do you want housing to look like in your community, and how does that relate to why you should vote. So it becomes a mobilizing conversation, and we're working, you know, with our tenant leaders as well to have those conversations in their communities at their tenant association meetings with their neighbors. And I think that's really the key, is that, you know, we get each other to vote. Like those one-on-one conversations we have with each other is a great way to spread positive information and motivate each other.
Yeah. On the more technical side, we also have been, I mean, at least at one of the, you know, some of the trainings we had, and what we plan to educate tenants on when door knocking, canvassing, is to let them know how to locate their poll site. I think that's very underestimated, especially here, because even before redistricting, again, people are often told to go to another poll site and come back. Once you're told that, or once you went to 2 poll sites, you don't want to go to both. You know, also something, you know, that we have, you know, mentioned in the past is that if you're registered, you don't need to register again every year. Those are questions that usually people have in New York. And also giving them the tool to check their status of voter registration, so they can know if they are not active and what to do if they are inactive, which is also common, especially with people who don't tend to vote. Unfortunately, fortunately, most of the people that, some of the people that we are organizing tend to vote in the general election. And we are also trying to educate people that general election is very important in New York, but because New York is a democratic state, the decisions are made during the primaries. By the time you go to the polls, you already know who won. I mean, when you go to vote in November, it's very unlikely that there will be a difference or a change in the person who won. So we really try to engage people and educate people about why they should be voting in the primaries. and how to make sure that they are not deferred from voting by telling them they are not registered, telling them they are not, they are at the wrong location. Because if you provide an information straight from the Board of Election, that should not be contradicted at the table by somebody who works there, who are often related to political parties, right? People who work at the election, at the Board of Election, who work on the poll site are chosen by the district leaders. And those are people favoring the incumbent, for example. Not that we are endorsing anybody, but we want people to be educated and free to vote for whoever they want to vote.
Totally. Yeah. Sometimes the best response to misinformation being out there is to amplify the accurate information and raise a positive, encouraging message. So really great to hear about all the incredible work you're doing. Thank you so much, Abby and Genesis, for being here, for answering our many, many questions. And yeah, we'll be sure to send out all the resources in the that are in the chats. And thank you to our audience for very engaging questions. I'm now going to pass it over to Sarah to talk about some exciting stuff that's happening on this topic in Congress.
Hi, everybody. It's good to be with you guys today. I'm going to share my screen and share my slides. Okay. And if you could just let me know if you can see them. Sorry.
I'm not seeing them yet.
Okay, let me try that again. No, is that not working?
I'm not seeing them yet. We might have to maybe turn off screen share for the current slideshow.
Oh, that's a good idea. May, yeah, thanks, May. No, let me try it again.
All right, yeah, see them now.
Okay, perfect. Okay. I wanted to share with all of you an update about a legislative effort that we are undertaking to try to help facilitate all of your efforts to increase voter engagement. I know that in past calls, we've talked about the Our Homes, Our Votes Act, which would add housing to, or HUD subsidized housing to the voter motor laws. This is a separate effort from that. So let me just dig right into it. Many of you may know that last year in March, the Biden administration issued an executive order about promoting access to voting. It essentially directed all federal agencies to look into ways that they could promote voter registration and participation, and encourage each agency to come back to the president with an outline of what they were able and willing to do. We partnered with DEMOS, ACLU, and the National Housing Law Project to encourage all the federal departments that have housing programs, including the Treasury program, which oversees the low-income housing tax credit, USDA, which oversees rural housing programs, and HUD, to take every possible action that they could to fulfill the mission of that executive order and to identify ways that they could be promoting voter registration. So we sent a couple of letters. You can see links to our letter from last September and in December, but we learned something that was really critical to our work that made us need to change gears. Essentially, we learned that there's very limited opportunity in HUD's existing programs to either require or facilitate more voter registration. The reason why I say that is because a lot of federal funding for housing programs under HUD are distributed by formula, and that those formulas are set. So there's not a lot of opportunity for HUD to add additional criteria that could help make decisions about how to allocate resources. We were also limited in HUD's ability to take on this action. We had heard that internally within the department, there were some questions about whether or not and to what extent HUD staff could work on voter registration issues unless there was either funding specifically for that or direction by Congress that this was an activity that HUD was able to do. So we wanted to help fix that problem. We shifted gears and turned our attention to two things. One, we wanted to make sure that we could use, at the time, we were very focused on making sure that HUD could use flexibilities in the competitive funding that was included in the budget reconciliation bill, to use that funding to facilitate voter registration. But as I'm sure all of you know, that bill is inching along very slowly and maybe won't include housing resources. So we figured that's not the best effort for us right now. Instead, we turned our attention to the appropriations bill for fiscal year 2023. And essentially, we were seeking language onto that bill that would either give funding directly to HUD to pay for the staff time that they would need to support voter engagement work, or funding for public housing agencies, resident councils, nonprofit owners, and others who could help implement it. We were really happy to see that in the House bill, there were a couple of different provisions that touch on civic engagement. They didn't use the word voter engagement, but we think civic engagement is just fine. So I want to talk about a couple of the ones that we saw. The first one is money for public housing. Public housing receives about $10 billion plus in the House bill, but there was a specific mention in the report language that $21 million of that total amount would be for resident participation activities, and that included very explicitly civic engagement. I will note that report language is a little bit different than bill language. So when we think of funding levels and how much money does the committee want to give towards this program or that program, typically folks look at the bill language, because once that passes, it is binding. It's an act of Congress, the law, and it has to be followed. Report language is something slightly different. It's a little softer. It's not binding in the same way that bill language is. It's really a way for committee members to communicate with HUD and other agencies to nudge them in the direction that we want to go in. So we saw this as a good nudge. The second piece in the report language was around project-based rental assistance. Again, you see $10 million of the total amount provided for PBRA that was directed towards tenant education and outreach, and they explicitly included civic engagement as one of those opportunities. I will say what this means is that if this bill were to be enacted, if this were the spending bill that goes through, that would mean that there are these resources that are available potentially to folks who are on this call, including resident organizers and other associations to do this work, nonprofit owners, et cetera. Finally, there was also report language that directed HUD to take several actions. First, the report language encouraged HUD to investigate to what extent HUD-assisted households are civically engaged, what sort of activities are allowed under current programs, how housing providers can be using best practices, and they asked HUD to come back to them and report on what additional authority they might need in order to increase civic engagement among HUD tenants. We thought this was really important because, one, it provides an opportunity for HUD to dig into these issues a little bit deeper, to pull out best practices and to disseminate them, to conduct research potentially on what's the most effective tactics. We're really pleased to see that this information is in there. It makes very clearly the case that civic engagement is a part of the important work that HUD does. I will say that we are, while we're excited to see this bill language, we know that there's still a long road ahead in terms of getting it across the finish line. The Senate is likely to introduce their draft spending bills soon. We've also raised this issue with them. We're encouraging them to take up the same language that we saw on the House side. It's a little bit more challenging on the Senate side. The House bill doesn't need Republican votes to get through. And so it's relatively easier to get the sort of report language added there. On the Senate side, I think that our Democratic colleagues might, even if they support it, they might face some obstacles with their Republican counterparts. That's because, as you know, any appropriations bill that moves forward has to get at least 10 Republican votes in the Senate. And so folks on those committees in the Senate are usually a little bit more cautious and aware of the fact that everything has to have bipartisan support. Regardless, we're going to keep working to try to see if we can keep this language in a final spending bill. Just to keep it on your radar, we don't expect a final bill until maybe November, December. So we have several months ahead of us to educate committee members and others about why this is important and why voter engagement really is seen as squarely within HUD's jurisdiction, and we'll keep folks involved. For right now, we're sort of playing it a little cautiously. I'll flag that for you. We're trying to be as careful as possible about which offices we bring this up with. We don't want to tip off too many folks who might be opponents to this being included in the bill. So for right now, I'd say there probably isn't a place for folks to be engaging on this particular proposal, but we will keep you in the loop as things move forward. And then with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see if folks have any questions about this effort.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That's all really helpful context, and just congratulations to you and everyone who worked so hard to get that into the bill. Also helpful to know that we're kind of keeping this not, on the DL, but that we're not advocating super loudly about it, and maybe it's a little bit of a quieter strategy right now, but still very much worth celebrating amongst ourselves. So thank you for sharing. We had one question from Steph of whether this would include help with the creation of a civic league in their small apartment complex with neighbors, to have educational materials to read up on it. I'm not sure, we might need more information to know if that would apply, but if you have any insight there for Steph, it would be helpful.
Yeah, I think it depends on what subsidy your property is receiving. If you live in public housing, I actually don't know. I need to look into it a little bit more. I just want to say that the two funding sources, one was through PVRA and one was through the public housing account. I need to dig into that a little bit more to see exactly who would be eligible for which of those funds.
Yeah, Steph, if you send me an email, we can dig into that further and find more information for you. And I also just want to share that Claudia noted that they're doing this already in Michigan, and when they get a voucher application, they also register to vote. That's really great. That's what we want to be happening everywhere. So thanks for sharing that, Claudia.
That's awesome.
I'm not seeing any other questions. So with that, I'm gonna pass it over to Sid. And thank you so much for joining us, Sarah, and sharing all this information.
Yeah, my pleasure. And I look forward to hopefully having some good news at the end of the year to share with everyone.
Thank you so much, Courtney, and thank you for having me on the call today. Super excited just to share about our upcoming Tenant Talk publication called Housing is Built with Ballots. It's going to be a special election themed tenant talk, and we've done a few in the past. I think the last couple of midterm years and general election years, we've done an election related tenant talk just to help provide folks with resources that you can use as a tenant and a community leader to help engage voters, candidates, and just engage in voter education as well. So if you're interested in receiving a paper copy of the publication, we do have a sign up for that, and it will be open up until July 29th, which I believe is the last Friday of the month. Thank you so much, Courtney. And yeah, there'll be a lot of different resources in there for you all. We're gonna kind of be going a lot of the information that we've covered in some of the webinars already, but kind of more specific to tenants, a little bit of history about like voter suppression and like knowing your rights, new laws that might have restricted voting in your communities and what you can do to combat those things, and how states are voting, tips on how to register folks, how to vote as somebody who's experiencing homelessness. And as always, we'll always have folks with lived experience kind of providing their ideas for advocacy in their communities. We're going to have 2 folks talk about how they held like voter registration events in their buildings. So super excited for that. And we'll have NLIHC updates at the end of that publication as well. But I'll take any questions if there are any, but I don't think I see any. But yeah, thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, Sid. Yeah, we're all super excited about the upcoming tenant talk. Definitely fill out the form if you'd like to get a paper copy. There's a lot of super exciting stuff in there. And yeah, just before we close out, we alluded to this during Genesis and Abby's presentation, but there are just so many resources on our website, and a lot of them are related to tenant engagement, both with voting and with getting candidates on the record. So Tenant Talk will have even more of those, but even before that publication is out, if you just can't wait to read some of the Our Homes, Our Votes materials, I would definitely recommend checking out our resource library. And specifically, we do have a fact sheet on best practices for registering renters and also for getting renters to engage in candidate forums. So a lot of those really incredible activities that we heard about that Tenants and Neighbors is doing, we have template guides that you can find and apply in your own work. As always, I also just want to remind everyone that if you're interested in getting more involved, if you've been coming to these webinars and you want to know what's the next step, I would encourage your organization to become an Our Homes, Our Votes affiliate. Affiliates are nonpartisan organizations that are formally identified with the campaign and committed to carrying out its goals. You'll have the opportunity to order some swag. You can use our resources and logo. And overall, it really just shows the strength of our movement all across the country to bring more pro-housing voters to the polls and close the voter turnout gap between low-income renters and homeowners. So we'll share the link to sign up to be an affiliate. As always, make sure you're following us on social media as well. And tune in, not next week, but the week after that, on Monday, July 25th, for our next webinar. We'll be pivoting a bit from the voter engagement piece to candidate engagement. We'll have our friends Kelly Sue Waller and Stephanie Isaacs from the Bedford County Listening Project and Lisa Chapman from Michigan Coalition Against Homelessness to talk about getting candidates on the record about housing and homelessness. So stay tuned for that. And then next week in this same time slot, we'll have the regular Monday housed national call, which I know many of you attend regularly as well. So I think that covers everything. If you have any remaining questions, feel free to throw those in the chat. I'll stay on for another minute. But if not, thank you so much to all of our panelists for being here. Yes, we'll send out a follow-up email by the end of the week with all of these resources and the chat and everything. And just really appreciate all of you being here and sharing all your enthusiasm.